The autonomic nervous system has components in both the central and the peripheral nervous system. The nuclei are going to be found throughout the brain in the hypothalamus, which is part of the forebrain, and in different regions of the brain stem, both midbrain and hindbrain. The motor neurons are going to travel through the spinal cord and through peripheral ganglia. And the axons will be heading off to the body through both cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Autonomic nervous system pathways, these motor or efferent pathways, are going to travel in a way that's very different from the somatic side of the nervous system, the somatic motor pathways. Remember, when we talked about the somatic efferent pathways, we said that they involve an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is originating either in the brain or the brain stem and is traveling out either to the brain stem or to the spinal cord. The lower motor neuron then travels from, again, either the brain stem or the spinal cord out to skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, we don't have this upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron arrangement. Instead, we talk about a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. Now, the preganglionic neuron cell body is going to be found in either the brainstem or the spinal cord. And the axon is then going to travel off to some ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. Now, that will synapse with a postganglionic neuron, whose axon is then going to go off to some effector cell. And of course, in the autonomic division, there's a range of effector cells. Remember, sometimes it's muscle, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle, sometimes it's glands. It's going to depend on which side of the autonomic nervous system you're looking at, either sympathetic or parasympathetic. On this slide, down at the bottom, you're looking at an image that you've seen before, depicting the somatic motor pathways with both upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. So we said the upper motor neuron can originate in either the cerebral cortex of the brain or the brain stem. That upper motor neuron is then going to synapse with a lower motor neuron that's located either in the brain stem or in the spinal cord. The lower motor neuron is then going to send its axon out into the periphery. Now, up at the top on this slide, you can see a comparison diagram to the autonomic division. So we're going to see a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron has its cell body in the central nervous system, and the axon is going to synapse with a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system, an autonomic ganglion. Then the postganglionic neuron is going to travel off to various effector tissues, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and so on. So let's switch gears now and look at the microscopic anatomy of these autonomic divisions. We'll start with the sympathetic side. So the sympathetic division of this autonomic nervous system is arising from two regions of the spinal cord, the thoracic region and the lumbar region. The preganglionic neurons are coming from the central nervous system. The cell body is going to be in the central nervous system, specifically in the lateral horns. If you recall when we talked about spinal cord anatomy, we said the gray matter was located in the center of the spinal cord and arranged in horns. We looked at the anterior horns and the posterior horns, and we said that there were lateral horns, but only in a certain region. That region was the thoracolumbar region. So the preganglionic neuron cell bodies are located in this lateral horn area in the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. The axons that are coming off of those neuron cell bodies are going to exit the spinal cord through spinal nerves T1 to L2. So not all the way through the lumbar region, but only part of the way. Those axons are going to travel a relatively short distance to hit the ganglia, the peripheral nervous system ganglia. These ganglia live very close to the spinal cord in a chain. We've actually seen these in a picture on an earlier slide. These are referred to as sympathetic chain ganglia, and they run parallel to the spinal cord, just outside of it. They are connected to the spinal cord. Each one of those sympathetic chain ganglia is connected to a corresponding spinal nerve through one of those branches of the spinal nerves that we talked about, and specifically the communicating branch. If you remember, we said each spinal nerve, as it unites the dorsal and ventral roots and emerges through the intervertebral foramen, it's going to fairly quickly branch into four. And one of those is called the communicating branch. And we said earlier that the communicating branch is going to innervate viscera. So this is part of that. That communicating branch is what carries these autonomic, sympathetic pathways. On this slide are a couple of diagrams that we've seen before. Again, just to remind us, up at the top, you're looking at a cross section or a transverse section through the spinal cord. You can see the gray matter in the center and the white matter surrounding it. You can see the larger anterior horns, the posterior horns, and here, this little bump right here and over here, those are lateral horns. And again, they're only found in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, or what we call the thoracolumbar region. You could see the dorsal root coming out with its dorsal root ganglion. You can see the ventral root. Remember, the dorsal root is carrying sensory information. The ventral root is taking motor information out towards the periphery. Down at the bottom, this is another diagram that we've used before. It shows the spinal cord over on the right. You can see, again, the dorsal root here with its associated dorsal root ganglion, sensory, and then the ventral root right here, motor. Those two roots are going to come together and create the mixed spinal nerve that exits the vertebral column and then branches. Remember, we said there's going to be a meningeal branch, there's going to be a communicating branch, and then the anterior and posterior ramus or rami. And on this slide, we're looking at this sympathetic chain of ganglia that's located just outside of the vertebral column itself. So you can see that we've got the bony vertebral column here. You can see the intervertebral discs. So the spinal cord is inside this structure. And then you can see that there are these ganglia, these beige sort of structures that are located in a chain outside of the vertebral column, but parallel to it. When we talk about sympathetic ganglia, we're specifically talking about those ganglia that are located in the thoracic region and the lumbar region. So that's the sympathetic anatomy. What about the parasympathetic anatomy? In comparison to the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic division has its neuron cell bodies in the brain and in the sacral region of the spinal cord. So we're going to see nerve fibers traveling through various cranial nerves and the sacral spinal nerves. Remember, there's two routes to the body. If the neuron is in the brain, it can send pathways out through cranial nerves. If it's in the spinal cord, it can send pathways out through spinal nerves. Neuron cell bodies that are the preganglionic neuron can be found again in regions of the brainstem. So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. We're also going to see neuron cell bodies in the spinal cord, but specifically in the sacral spinal cord, and specifically from S2 to S4. Now, those preganglionic neuron cell bodies are going to send axons out to synapse with ganglia that are not up close to the spinal cord. Instead, they're going to be either in or very close to the target organ. Now, one important thing to note is right here. There's a lot less divergence of the nerves in the parasympathetic division compared to the sympathetic division. We're just not going to see the amount of branching in these nerves in the peripheral part of the nervous system that we do on the sympathetic side. Now, this is a very busy diagram, but I put it in just to show us visually how these parasympathetic tracks travel. Remember, we can have our preganglionic neuron located either in the brainstem or way down in the sacral region of the spinal cord. That preganglionic neuron is going to send out its axon into the periphery, and it's going to synapse with a postganglionic neuron at a ganglion that is somewhere close to or actually within the target organ. So we're not looking at chain ganglia right next to the spinal cord when we're talking about the parasympathetic side. The postganglionic neuron is going to send its axon to the effector organ, to the target organ. And of course, it's going to vary depending on whether the preganglionic neuron started in the brainstem. Those are going to be impacting structures higher up in the body, if you will, more superior, so structures in the head, the heart, the lungs, and so on, the liver. Or if the preganglionic neuron started in the sacral region of the spinal cord, then we're talking more about lower target organs like urinary tract and so on. Here's another busy looking slide. I put this one in because it compares the sympathetic tracts and the parasympathetic tracts. So remember, on the sympathetic side, we're talking about the thoracolumbar region, specifically T1 to L2, what you're looking at in green here. The preganglionic neuron has its cell body in this region of the spinal cord. It's going to send out an axon that doesn't have to travel very far because it's going to synapse with ganglia that are located parallel and very close to the spinal cord. They're going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron, which is then going to send its axon out to some effector organ, some target organ. Now, compare that with the parasympathetic side, which is going to have its preganglionic neuron cell body in either the brain stem or the sacral region of the spinal cord. So that's what you're looking at in these blue-purple regions. The preganglionic neuron cell body is located either in the brainstem, and remember we said specifically midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, or down in the sacral region of the spinal cord, specifically S2 to S4. So green over here, sympathetic, purple, blue over here, and over here for parasympathetic. That's where the preganglionic neuron cell body resides. On the parasympathetic side, it's that preganglionic neuron is sending its axon way off to some synapse with a postganglionic neuron. And that postganglionic neuron is in a ganglion that is either close to or actually within the target organ. And you can follow some of these purple lines and see where some of these are actually within the organ. So very different looking. The preganglionic axons on the sympathetic side don't have long to travel before they synapse with the postganglionic neuron. On the parasympathetic side, the preganglionic axons do have a long way to travel before they synapse. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about the effects that the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions have on these target organs. Remember, neither the sympathetic nor the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system has either purely stress or alertness or purely calming, relaxing effects. It doesn't work that way. It's tempting to say that the sympathetic division is all about alertness and stress, and the parasympathetic side is all about calming and relaxing. But it's not true. Neither side has pure function like that. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions can have contrasting effects on target organs, but they're not purely of either type. They're not purely stress or purely relax. Now, the reason that sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are able to have very different effects on the same organ is because of two things. Is because of different neurotransmitters in both divisions and different postsynaptic membrane receptors. Remember, we said neurotransmitters vary quite a bit in what effect they're going to have on the postsynaptic cell. We also talked about the general kinds of receptors on that postsynaptic cell membrane. We said some of those are ionotropic and some are metabotropic. And that distinction is going to be important in the autonomic nervous system. So all autonomic nervous system synapses everywhere that the preganglionic axon is synapsing with the postganglionic neuron, we're going to see either acetylcholine or norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter. Each neurotransmitter has, again, two choices of a receptor to bind to, right? It's either going to bind to an ionotropic receptor or a metabotropic receptor. We're going to introduce some new vocabulary now to talk about these post-ganglionic neuron membrane receptors. Acetylcholine is going to get secreted by that preganglionic neuron in both divisions, in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the preganglionic neuron is going to send an axon out to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. We've talked about that. And on both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side, that preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine. Now, the acetylcholine is going to travel across the synapse and it's going to bind to receptors on the membrane of the postganglionic neuron. And it's binding to acetylcholine receptors that are called nicotinic. That's a new term for us. Now, the postganglionic neuron is going to secrete acetylcholine at the target organ, but only on the parasympathetic side. That acetylcholine is going to bind to receptors on the membrane, if you will, of cells in the target organ. But this time we're going to call those acetylcholine receptors muscarinic. Now, what about the sympathetic side? We said that in both divisions, acetylcholine gets released by the preganglionic neuron. But on the sympathetic side, it's norepinephrine that gets released by the postganglionic neuron. And it's going to bind to receptors called adrenergic receptors. Now let's walk through this again. Start on the sympathetic side. The preganglionic neuron, the cell body, is located in the spinal cord, somewhere between T1 and L2. That neuron is going to send an electrical signal down its axon. Doesn't have to travel very far because there's going to be a synapse in that synaptic ganglion chain located parallel to the spinal cord. At that synapse, that preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine is going to travel across the synapse and it's going to bind to receptors on the next cell, the postsynaptic cell, which is called a postganglionic neuron. Those receptors, those acetylcholine receptors, are called nicotinic. Now, the acetylcholine is going to have an effect on that postganglionic neuron, and that effect is going to travel down the axon until it synapses with the target organ. And because we're on the sympathetic side, that postganglionic neuron is going to release norepinephrine into that synapse. The norepinephrine is going to travel across the synapse and it's going to bind to receptors on that target organ. We're going to call those adrenergic receptors. That norepinephrine is going to have an effect on the target organ. Now let's look at the parasympathetic side. The preganglionic neuron has its cell body in either the brainstem, specifically midbrain, pons, or medulla oblongata, or it might have its preganglionic neuron cell body in the sacral region of the spinal cord. It's going to send an impulse down the axon. It's going to have to travel a much longer distance, but it will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And at that synapse, it's going to release acetylcholine, just like on the sympathetic side. The acetylcholine will travel across the synapse, and it will bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neuron membrane. That's going to have an effect on the postganglionic neuron, which is going to travel to the effector organ, and it's going to release more acetylcholine at the synapse with the effector organ. But this time the acetylcholine binds to a different type of receptor, a muscarinic receptor on the target organ. I think you'll find that while you're studying, it'd be very helpful to draw out these pathways and this terminology. Something similar to this, if you find it helpful. Here's the sympathetic pathway, here's the parasympathetic pathway. But we've included both the neurotransmitter and the postsynaptic receptor type. So sympathetic pathway, we're in the central nervous system, specifically in the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. Here's the cell body, the neuron cell body. Here's the axon. It's traveling a short distance to where it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. At that synapse, acetylcholine gets released, and it's going to bind to receptors that we call nicotinic. It's going to have an effect on this postganglionic neuron. That effect will travel down the axon, and it will synapse with the target tissue, whatever that is. At that synapse, since we're on the sympathetic side, we're going to release norepinephrine, and it's going to bind to adrenergic receptors. Now, for the parasympathetic side, we're also going to start in the central nervous system, but this time either in the brainstem or the sacral region. The axon that comes off of that neuron cell body is going to have to travel a much longer distance before it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. At this synapse, acetylcholine is released and it binds to nicotinic receptors, just like we saw here. It's going to have an effect on the postganglionic neuron. That effect is going to travel down the axon. We're going to synapse with the target tissue here, but this time we're going to release more acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic receptors. Here's another diagram that I thought was helpful because it also compares sympathetic and parasympathetic, as well as good old somatic, so we don't forget about the somatic side. Remember long ago when we talked about the somatic side of the nervous system, when we said motor pathways travel out from the central nervous system to the neuromuscular junction, where acetylcholine is released and it has an excitatory effect. We didn't use the term nicotinic back then. We just said that the acetylcholine binds to receptors at the level of the skeletal muscle. It binds to receptors on the sarcolemma, and it has an excitatory effect, and it causes muscle contraction. So now we can add in a little bit more information. That excitatory effect at that nicotinic receptor. It turns out that these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are of the ionotropic type. Remember what that means. That means that those receptors are actual ion channels. And when acetylcholine binds to them, it causes them to change shape and open up. And sodium can rush in to that muscle fiber and cause depolarization, cause new action potentials to be generated. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are excitatory and ionotropic. Muscarinic, and you only find those in the parasympathetic division, muscarinic acetylcholine receptors can be either excitatory or inhibitory, and they are metabotropic receptors. That means that when the acetylcholine binds, they're not ion channels themselves. When the acetylcholine binds, it causes a shape change in the muscarinic receptor that then triggers a nearby ion channel to open. Muscarinic can be either excitatory or inhibitory, and they are metabotropic type of receptors. So we're going to find nicotinic receptors on both the somatic side of the nervous system and the autonomic. And in the autonomic side, we're going to find nicotinic receptors in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. Muscarinic receptors are only found in one place, autonomic side and only parasympathetic.